He has K-State 73rd in his power poll. 73rd, people. 73rd. That's good for a tie for 7th, which also functions as a tie for 9th in the Big 12. Texas Tech and Baylor being the other two teams K-State is tied with, only ahead of Kansas in the league. So Phil Steele has K-State 73rd in the country and only better than one team in the Big 12 Conference. K-State has the 6th toughest schedule in the country, according to Phil Steele, which certainly factors in here. And if you're going by his position rankings, his unit rankings, he ranks the top 50 in the country, and K-State only had 3 units that were in the top 50. Quarterbacks, which are 43rd, running backs 23rd, special teams 19th, which honestly, the part that I disagree with out of that is special teams. That feels a lot to me like staking the reputation of K-State special teams, putting them in the top 25, combined with the fact that Les Miles somewhere is still punting the ball to Phillip Brooks inexplicably. I mean, that's what it feels like that's all based on. I digress. Here's the thing, man. It's hard to argue too much with his position rankings, like the unit rankings. Like where, in terms of like proven talent that K-State has on the team, is it better than tied for 7th in the Big 12? I wouldn't think so. I don't think so. And it rarely is. I mean, you'd have to go back to like 2014, I suppose, with like Lockett and, the wrong quarterback throwing him the ball. It might have been all right. Some of those dudes, Ryan Mueller, they had some talent there. That would have been more middle of the pack if we're talking about talent relative to the rest of the conference. But K-State never has an overly talented roster, never has an overly talented team on paper. And if I'm Phil Steele and I'm doing the unit rankings here, the changes that I would make, I just said special teams, I don't think I would have K-State as a top 20 special teams unit. Nothing against Phillip Brooks. I just don't think, especially relative to like K-State's history at special teams, I don't think he's anything all that special of a return man. I think he had one game where Kansas just kept kicking in the ball. I also know that K-State needs a new kicker this year. So I would drop that unit. I think the defensive backs deserve to be in the top 50. I think they're better than Phil Steele is giving them credit for. And I think the offensive line probably deserves to be in the top 50 as well. So there are some tweaks that I would make, but it's still, there's nothing overwhelming. There's no overwhelming unit here. There's no overwhelmingly talented player. I mean, Skylar Thompson didn't make the top 4 all Big 12 teams. He's your quarterback. I know we're all excited about that, and I love Skylar. But it's an argument. I mean, you have to really work to argue if you're going to get him into the top 4 of the conference in terms of quarterbacks. So, like, on paper, that does not really, to me, equate a team that's much better than tied for 7th in the Big 12. The underlying thing here that we're all missing in that discussion is coaching, right? And for a long time, Phil Steele seemed to be slightly higher, like a rung higher, maybe half a rung higher than most of the preseason magazines because of Bill Snyder. He was always very deferential to Snyder and would say, this guy, I know his coaching chops, that's going to have me put K-State a spot or two higher than I would. I mean, he would spell it out about as plainly as that. In fact, I didn't check the tape. I probably should have. He said that, I'm certain, multiple times on the air here talking with us. Kleiman doesn't have that kind of cachet and respect at this level yet. Not from Phil, anyway. Now, I would argue we saw the coaching chops akin to what Snyder always did with K-State's roster 2 years ago. That was a team that was picked 9th in the Big 12 preseason poll. Okay, that was a team that did not have an NFL draft pick following the season, and yet Chris Kleiman got them to 8-4. So to me, that indicates similar coaching chops. But we only saw it for 1 year, and then last year, the wheels totally fell off. Those of us that are close to the program and follow it here would say, well, there were a lot of COVID issues that affected that, and then obviously the quarterback being out really affected that. But if you are somebody who's not living it, breathing it every single day, following it on an intricate basis, and frankly, if you're not somebody who wears a shade of the purple in the glasses, I could understand how you'd look at that and be like, well, what am I supposed to make of that? I can't trust that. I'm just going to start back at square one here after the first 2 seasons of Kleiman and say, well, this roster is not overly talented. This is about where it would sit talent-wise in the league. And this coach has shown me 1 year of good, 1 year of bad. I don't know. I'm going to have to put him tied for 7th. And he threw in a line in his little blurb about K-State that said, like, hey, I kind of hate doing this because I do feel like he actually said the defense was underrated. Said, I kind of hate doing this, but I have to. I don't blame him. I do disagree. I think K-State will finish more middle of the pack in the league with a shot at finishing in the upper portion of the league. I don't think they'll be tied for 7th. I think they're better than I think they're definitely better than Texas Tech. I think they're probably better than Baylor. And then we start talking about really mincing a lot of details there for getting into like the TCU, Oklahoma States of the world. So that's where I stand after seeing that today. I'm not offended. I disagree, but I'm not offended with what I saw from Phil Steele.
I disagree with Phil Steele where he has the Cats. I would never put K-State as a bottom 5 type of team. I would probably put them right now 5th place. Just in my heart, 5th place team right now. I will disagree with you on the special teams. As a matter of fact, I'm a little bit offended that you would have special teams you outside of the top 20 in the country. So, Phillip Brooks, you are right. I will give you that. Let me get in my 2 cents, and then I'll let you respond.
Okay.
So, Phillip Brooks did have his great game. KU, bunch of dum-dums kept kicking to him after he was already hot. He was a ball of fire. No, everybody was getting burned by Phillip Brooks in the KU game. That's on the Jayhawks.
It's like NBA Jam, when he was running, he just had fire tailing out of the
Or
backfield.
NFL Blitz.
Yeah.
NFL Blitz.
Yeah.
I mean, he was just on fire. Impossible to get, He had a fantastic game, and that's shame on KU, but also awesome because he almost had 3 of them in the first half. Yet K-State still has history of kick returning coming back to this team because Malik Knowles was a great returner back in 2019. He had a very key kickoff return for a score against Mississippi State. Do not forget that.
Fair.
And also Deuce Vaughn. Deuce returned multiple kickoffs, 7 kickoffs last year. He had one that went for 40 yards. There is great possibility this next season, if he does return kicks, he's going to break one sooner or later.
Okay, fair point about the returners. The problem there is I don't think that you want to tire Deuce out by having him return kicks because he functions as your best receiver and running back. And then Knowles, you know what I'm going to say about Malik Knowles. It was great when he was returning kicks, but then it's extra reps of him running out there, which Malik Knowles, moving in any direction, is an injury risk at all times. So injury risk, wearing a guy out, I don't know how much you can use those, and then again you're left with Brooks, who I think is good. I think he's solid. I just think a lot of times people with those positions just look at the numbers, and the numbers are obviously inflated by what happened against Kansas. The other thing I would say about special teams, they lost Stanton Weber, and I don't mean to sound alarm bells about that, but they've kept special teams up and humming since Snyder left. I think a lot of that was the job that Stanton Weber was doing. He's as much a disciple. He's an OG, one of the 12, the whole thing. Last Supper, all of that. Disciple of Bill Snyder special teams, former captain of the team who was a special teams guy back in the day, and then sticks around to kind of blend the two together, merge new concept from Kleiman with what K-State was doing under Snyder, and it helped keep things going. I think that can be an underrated loss for the season, the fact that he's now at South Carolina. So that's why I say that about special teams. Either way, I do feel like that part of the discussion is probably inconsequential to what we're really talking about here. We both feel like this team will be better because we both have more of a belief in Chris Kleiman, but also, and admittedly, at least for me, I shouldn't speak for you, but for me, admittedly, a bias by being somebody who's around them, wants them to succeed, has a vested interest, not just as a fan, but a financial vested interest, or just quality of life, vested interest in them succeeding. So there's some of that comes into play too. And so that's a part of why I bring this up. I just like to say, a lot of times, the fan base always has a chip on its shoulder, always talking about how people are hating on them. As a lot of fan bases do, by the way. But if you're really looking at this through just purely neutral glasses, it's very understandable, I think, to see where Phil Steele got to where he got. There are a lot of question marks that this team has to answer. Do they have a receiver? Do they have a legitimate Big 12 caliber frontline receiver? Do they have a tight end that can stay healthy? Amanda Bebe, Sammy Wheeler, those guys have always been hurt. Do they have anything behind Deuce that's going to be reliable at running back? We've talked about this. Jacardier, doghouse last year. Joe Irvin didn't even play last year. They just lost Mosey to Miami, Ohio. Like, and we haven't even gotten to the defense, which is where really most of the questions are. Depth in the secondary. They're taking these FCS transfers all of a sudden to try and fill things out. Can they stay healthy enough there? Do they have any frontline linebackers? A lot of questions. Replacing the lone draft pick on the defensive line. There are a ton of questions across the board for this team. So it's reasonable, I would say, to put them at tied for 7th in the Big 12, even if I disagree with that. I think it's a reasonable opinion and a reasonable take. Enough from Phil Steele.